You shouldn't talk to your boss like that. The sentence landed softly in the glass-walled boardroom, yet somehow it carried farther than the hum of the air conditioning, farther than the quiet clicking of keyboards along the wall, farther even than the low conversation of 12 executives seated around the polished walnut table on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Capitol Tower in downtown Chicago. For half a second no one reacted. Then Richard Whitmore laughed. It was not a polite chuckle or a confused breath of amusement. It was the full, confident laugh of a man who had spent 30 years building a company worth billions, the kind of laugh that assumed the entire room would follow his lead. And they did. A few board members smiled into their coffee cups. One of the younger analysts at the end of the table tried to hide a grin behind a tablet. Someone muttered something about interns getting lost again. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting the cuff of his tailored navy suit, as if the moment required no more attention than brushing lint from his sleeve. Across the long table stood the girl who had spoken. She looked out of place in a room designed for power. The executives wore tailored jackets and polished shoes that reflected the recessed lighting above them. She wore a simple charcoal jacket over a plain white shirt and dark jeans that had probably never seen a corporate boardroom before. Her hair was pulled neatly back, her posture straight, her expression calm in a way that made the laughter around her seem louder than it really was. Richard tapped the table once with the side of his pen, still smiling. "Young lady," he said, his voice warm with amused patience, "I don't know who let you wander in here, but this meeting is for senior leadership only." A few quiet chuckles rolled through the room again. The girl didn't move. She didn't raise her voice either. She simply looked at him, steady and unhurried, like someone watching a clock tick toward a moment only she could see. Richard gestured toward the spilled coffee near the edge of the conference table where a nervous assistant had fumbled a cup minutes earlier. "If you're part of the support staff," he added casually, "there's a towel station down the hall. Might want to take care of that before it stains the wood." One of the executives cleared his throat awkwardly. Another glanced toward the glass doors, perhaps expecting security to appear. But the girl reached into her bag instead. Not quickly, not defensively, just calmly, like someone retrieving a document she had been expecting to show all along. She placed a slim black card on the table in front of Richard. The plastic surface caught the overhead light for a moment before settling into stillness beside his coffee cup. No logo, no department label, just a matte black rectangle with a single silver strip along the edge. Richard looked down at it briefly, his smile fading just a fraction, the way a man pauses when a joke takes an unexpected turn. "I believe," the girl said quietly, "you should check the ownership filing that was processed this morning." Around the table a few brows furrowed. Someone shifted in a chair. Margaret Klein, the board chair seated halfway down the table, leaned slightly forward, her eyes moving from the card to the girl's face with a sudden focus that hadn't been there before. Richard picked up the card between two fingers as if it weighed almost nothing. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the distant traffic 40 stories below and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights above the ceiling panels. He turned the card over once, then again, and for the first time since the girl had spoken, Richard Whitmore wasn't laughing. Richard Whitmore held the black card between his fingers a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for the room to reassure him that the situation was still a joke. The silver strip along the edge reflected the ceiling lights in a thin, quiet line. Around the long table, the earlier laughter had already faded into something softer and uncertain. Margaret Klein leaned forward slightly in her chair, studying the card the way a seasoned executive studies a contract clause that feels too important to skim. Richard finally set the card down beside his coffee cup and looked back up at the girl standing across from him. "All right," he said with a controlled smile that had returned to his face, though it was tighter now. "Let us assume for a moment that this is not some kind of prank. Who exactly are you supposed to be?" The girl met his eyes. Without hesitation, "My name is Ava Johnson," she said. The room stayed quiet. A junior analyst at the far end of the table typed something quickly on a tablet, perhaps searching the company directory, perhaps checking whether the meeting calendar had accidentally been shared with the wrong department. Richard folded his hands on the table. "Miss Johnson," he said slowly, "Whitmore Capital employs nearly 6,000 people across this country. That means I occasionally meet someone whose name I do not recognize. But that does not explain why you believe you can walk into a private board meeting and claim authority over this company. Ava did not react to the weight in his voice. She simply glanced toward Margaret Klein. You should open the corporate registry update that was filed this morning, she said. Margaret blinked once, surprised by the calm certainty in the girl's tone. She reached toward the slim laptop in front of her and tapped the screen awake. A few seconds passed while she navigated through internal emails and notifications. Richard leaned back again, watching the process with mild curiosity that still carried the posture of control. You see, he said lightly to the others. This is what happens when someone confuses the internet with reality. A few people smiled again, though no one laughed this time. Margaret's expression changed first. It was subtle, almost invisible at the start, a small tightening around the eyes as she scrolled through a message marked urgent by the company legal department. The cursor on her screen paused. She read the subject line again. Then she opened the attachment. Richard noticed the silence before he noticed her face. Margaret, he said casually. She did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved across the document line by line, while the quiet hum of the boardroom seemed to grow louder. Finally, she lifted her head slightly and looked toward the general counsel seated 2 chairs away. Did you see this filing? She asked. The lawyer frowned and leaned toward his own laptop. What filing? Margaret rotated her screen slightly so he could read the header. The man's eyebrows pulled together as he scanned the page. Richard tapped the table once with his pen again, the sound sharper now. Would someone mind explaining why we are treating a random interruption like a shareholder meeting? He asked. Ava stood still across the table, hands resting lightly against the strap of her bag. Because it is one, she said quietly. Margaret's gaze shifted from the screen to Ava again. This document states that an ownership trust executed last night has activated controlling shares in Whitmore Capital, she said carefully. The lawyer beside her leaned closer to read the numbers again. 51%. The figure sat at the center of the page in bold legal formatting that left no room for interpretation. Richard's pen stopped moving. That is impossible, he said. Margaret did not look away from Ava when she spoke next. The controlling shareholder listed in the trust is Ava Daniel Johnson. A few chairs creaked softly as people straightened in their seats. The junior analyst at the end of the table stopped typing entirely. Richard turned slowly toward the girl standing across from him. You are telling me, he said, each word measured now, that you somehow believe you own this company. Ava did not smile. She did not raise her voice. She only nodded once. No, she said. I do not believe it. She glanced toward Margaret's laptop screen where the legal filing still glowed under the conference room lights. Then she looked back at Richard Whitmore. The board confirmed it. Richard Whitmore did not respond immediately. The words seemed to settle across the polished table like dust after a sudden movement, quiet but impossible to ignore. 51%. The numbers still glowed on Margaret Klein's laptop screen, large and unmistakable under the boardroom lights. For the first time since the meeting had begun, Richard leaned forward instead of leaning back. His fingers rested flat on the table, and the confident rhythm that had once guided the entire room seemed to pause with him. There has to be some mistake, he said finally, his voice calm but noticeably lower than before. Margaret did not look away from the document. The filing came directly from the firm that manages the Whitmore Family Trust, she replied. It was processed at 8:32 this morning through the Delaware Corporate Registry. The general counsel beside her adjusted his glasses and leaned closer again, scrolling through the digital paperwork. The authentication signatures are valid, he said quietly. This was authorized through the original trust structure. Richard shook his head once, slow and deliberate. I created the majority of this company, he said. There is no trust arrangement that allows a stranger to walk in here and take control. Ava Johnson stood across the table without shifting her posture. Her calm presence felt almost out of place against the growing tension that was spreading through the room. You did not create the trust, she said gently. Your father did. The name hung in the air without explanation. Several board members exchanged glances, and Margaret's eyes moved from the document back to Ava again with a new level of attention. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. My father passed away 8 years ago, he said. Yes, Ava replied. And before he did, he amended the trust. The general counsel stopped scrolling. There is an addendum here, he murmured. Dated 2 months before Daniel Whitmore died. Margaret straightened slightly in her chair. "Read it," she said. The lawyer cleared his throat and scanned the paragraph carefully. The boardroom stayed silent except for the soft movement of the air conditioning vents above the ceiling panels. "The trust activates a contingency clause," he said slowly. "If controlling management demonstrates conduct that compromises the long-term integrity of Whitmore Capital, majority ownership transfers to the beneficiary listed in the document." Richard looked from the lawyer to Margaret and then back to Ava. "And we are supposed to believe that beneficiary is you," he said. Ava nodded once. "Yes." Margaret turned the screen slightly again, examining the final page. "The beneficiary is listed as Ava Daniel Johnson," she said. "The legal record confirms identity through birth documentation and trust verification." The name settled over the room in a way that felt heavier than the earlier number. Daniel Whitmore had been more than just the founder of the company. For many of the people seated around that table, he had been the man who built the entire organization from a small investment firm in a two-room office nearly 40 years earlier. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "Daniel," he repeated quietly. Ava reached into her bag again and removed a thin envelope, placing it gently on the table between them. The paper was worn slightly at the edges, as if it had been carried carefully for years. "Your father wrote this letter the same week he finalized the amendment," she said. Richard stared at the envelope without touching it. Margaret leaned forward again. "You may want to read it," she said. Richard finally picked it up. The paper inside unfolded with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the still room. His eyes moved across the page quickly at first, then slower as the meaning settled in. A few seconds passed before he lowered the letter again. No one spoke. Ava watched him quietly. "My grandfather believed leadership was more than numbers," she said. "He believed it required something he called decency." Richard looked up sharply. The room waited. Ava's voice stayed calm. "And he believed that if that disappeared from this company, someone new would need to remind it what it meant." Margaret glanced again at the legal filing on her laptop screen, then back at the young woman standing across from the head of the table. The silence in the boardroom had changed completely now. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition. The silence in the boardroom stretched longer than anyone expected. Richard Whitmore still held the letter between his fingers, the paper slightly creased where his grip had tightened without him noticing. Across the polished walnut table, Ava Johnson stood quietly, her posture steady, her eyes fixed not on the letter but on the man reading it. Around them the executives remained frozen in their seats, as if the room itself had decided to pause while the past caught up with the present. Richard finally placed the letter back on the table. The confident rhythm that had always defined him seemed to hesitate for the first time in decades. "My father never mentioned anything like this to me," he said slowly. His voice was no longer amused, and it was no longer dismissive. It carried something closer to uncertainty. Margaret Klein folded her hands together and looked toward the envelope again. "Daniel Whitmore was known for planning several steps ahead," she said carefully. "It would not be surprising if he structured the trust in a way that protected the company even from internal leadership." The general counsel nodded quietly beside her. "The amendment clearly states that the trust was designed to activate only under specific circumstances," he added. Richard glanced toward the screen where the legal filing still glowed. 51% controlling interest. The number had not changed. Ava spoke again, her tone calm but steady. "Your father believed the company should never become a place where power mattered more than people." Richard looked up sharply. "You are standing in the headquarters of a company that employs thousands," he said. "Power and responsibility are part of leadership." Ava nodded once. Responsibility is exactly what he was worried about. Margaret's gaze moved between them, her expression thoughtful. "There is another section in the trust amendment," she said quietly as she scrolled again through the document. The general counsel leaned closer. "It references a recorded message left by Daniel Whitmore," he said after a moment. "A confirmation statement meant to accompany the activation of the clause." Richard frowned slightly. "A recorded message," he repeated. Margaret turned the laptop screen toward the center of the table so the others could see. A small video file icon appeared beneath the legal text, dated the same day as the amendment. For a moment no one spoke. The quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed louder again as the executives leaned forward in their chairs. Margaret clicked the file. The screen flickered once before the image appeared. The face that filled the display belonged to a man many of them had not seen in years, but still recognized immediately. Daniel Whitmore sat behind a simple wooden desk, the same desk that once stood in the original Whitmore Capital office decades earlier. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his voice carried the steady warmth that had built the company long before the tower in downtown Chicago existed. "If you are watching this message," Daniel said calmly, "then the trust one created has already been activated." The boardroom remained completely silent as the recording continued. "This company was never meant to belong to one man," he said. "It was meant to belong to an idea. The idea that leadership requires character as much as intelligence." Richard stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. Daniel continued speaking with the quiet confidence that had once guided the entire organization. "If the board has confirmed that Ava Johnson now holds the controlling shares, then it means the moment I prepared for has finally arrived." Several executives exchanged quick glances. Ava remained still beside the table, listening. "Ava is my granddaughter," Daniel said clearly in the recording, "and she represents the future I hoped this company would protect." Richard's head lifted slightly at the word granddaughter. The room absorbed the revelation in a heavy silence. Daniel leaned forward slightly in the video, his eyes calm but firm. "Leadership should never forget the people who built the foundation beneath it," he said. "And if that lesson is ever lost, the next generation must be brave enough to restore it." The recording ended with a soft click as the screen returned to the legal document. For several seconds no one moved. The boardroom that once echoed with Richard Whitmore's laughter now held a completely different kind of quiet. Margaret Klein slowly closed the laptop and looked toward Ava Johnson standing across the table. The weight of the moment had shifted, and for the first time since the meeting had begun, every person in the room understood that the company they thought they knew had just changed forever. No one in the boardroom spoke after the video ended. The reflection of the paused screen still hovered faintly across the polished walnut table, and for a moment it felt as if Daniel Whitmore's presence had not completely left the room. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the blank laptop screen where his father's face had appeared only seconds earlier. Around him, the executives who had followed his leadership for years were now looking somewhere else, some at the documents on the table, others at Ava Johnson standing quietly near the end of the room. The silence did not feel confused anymore. It felt like a turning point. Margaret Klein was the first to move. She closed the laptop fully and placed both hands on the table as if preparing to speak not just as a board member, but as the chair responsible for the company's direction. "The trust clause has been verified," she said calmly. "The documentation is authentic and legally binding." The general counsel beside her nodded once in agreement. "The controlling shares have transferred according to the amendment," he added. 51% ownership now rests with Ava Daniel Johnson. Richard finally exhaled slowly, leaning back into the high leather chair that had always symbolized his authority. His gaze moved across the room, studying the same executives who had once laughed along with him only minutes earlier. No one was laughing now. Ava stood exactly where she had been standing since the beginning of the meeting, her calm presence unchanged even as the entire structure of power inside the room shifted around her. Richard looked at her again, this time, not with disbelief, but with something closer to careful curiosity. "My father believed you were the future of this company," he said quietly. Ava did not answer immediately. She looked around the boardroom once, taking in the long table, the glass walls, the skyline of Chicago stretching beyond the windows 42 floors below. "He believed the company needed someone who remembered where it started," she replied. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Daniel Whitmore often spoke about the early days," she said. "Back when Whitmore Capital operated out of a two-room office above a hardware store." A few of the older board members nodded softly at the memory. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Ava again. "And you think you understand that history better than the people who have run this company for decades?" he asked. Ava's voice remained steady. "I understand what he wanted the company to represent," she said. She reached into her bag once more and placed a small worn notebook on the table beside the letter Richard had already read. The cover was simple brown leather, the edges softened from years of use. "My grandfather gave me this when I was 16, she explained. Margaret glanced at the notebook with interest. "What is it?" Ava opened the cover gently, and turned it so the board could see the first page. The handwriting inside was unmistakably Daniel Whitmore's. Careful lines of ink filled the page with thoughts that looked less like financial strategies and more like personal reflections. These are the notes he wrote during the first 10 years of the company, Ava said. Before the skyscrapers. Before the investors. Before the boardrooms. Richard stared at the familiar handwriting, recognition flickering across his face. Ava continued quietly. He wrote that a company becomes dangerous the moment it forgets the people it was built to serve. The room remained silent as the words settled in. Margaret looked from the notebook to Ava again. Your grandfather trusted you to carry that idea forward, she said thoughtfully. Ava nodded once. He trusted the board to recognize when it was time. Richard rested his hands slowly on the table, the letter and the notebook lying between him and the young woman his father had chosen. The authority he had carried for so many years had not vanished, but something inside the room had undeniably shifted. He studied Ava for another long moment before speaking again. You walked into this room knowing exactly what would happen, he said. Ava met his gaze calmly. No, she replied. I walked in hoping the company my grandfather built was still strong enough to hear the truth. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard Whitmore did not respond immediately. Richard Whitmore remained still for several seconds after Ava finished speaking. The skyline outside the glass walls shimmered in the late afternoon sunlight, but inside the boardroom the air felt heavier than before, as if every person present understood that the balance of power had quietly shifted while no one was watching. Richard slowly folded his hands on the table, his eyes resting on the worn leather notebook that Ava had placed beside the letter. He recognized his father's handwriting immediately. The same careful script had once filled yellow legal pads during long evenings when Whitmore Capital was nothing more than a small investment firm with 2 desks and a borrowed fax machine. For the first time that morning, Richard did not look like the man who controlled the room. He looked like a son remembering something he had not thought about in years. Margaret Klein observed the change with quiet attention. As chair of the board, she had worked beside Richard for more than 15 years. Long enough to recognize when confidence gave way to reflection. Daniel Whitmore believed leadership was tested in moments exactly like this one, she said calmly. Her voice was steady, but it carried across the room with the quiet authority of someone who had watched the company evolve from a growing firm into a global investment powerhouse. Richard lifted his gaze toward Ava again. You said he gave you that notebook when you were 16, he said slowly. Ava nodded once. He told me it was not a record of money, she replied. He said it was a record of decisions. The executives seated around the table listened carefully now. The earlier tension had transformed into something else entirely. Curiosity. Richard leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the polished wood. What kind of decisions? He asked. Ava gently opened the notebook again and turned a few pages until she found a passage written in darker ink than the rest. She did not read it aloud immediately. Instead, she slid the notebook toward the center of the table so Margaret and the other board members could see the page. Margaret leaned closer and quietly read the first line. After a moment, she spoke it aloud. A company that grows faster than its values will eventually lose both. The words lingered in the room like a quiet echo. Richard's expression tightened slightly. My father wrote many things, he said. Running a business requires more than philosophy. Ava did not argue. She simply turned another page. He also wrote about responsibility, she said. Margaret read the next line softly. If power becomes the goal instead of the tool, the company will forget who it serves. The general counsel shifted slightly in his chair, studying the handwriting more closely. Several of the board members exchanged thoughtful glances. Richard watched the notebook for another moment before speaking again. You believe that is happening here, he said. Ava met his gaze calmly. I believe my grandfather wanted the board to decide that question, she answered. Margaret straightened slightly in her chair. The responsibility of leadership had returned to the center of the room. Daniel Whitmore designed the trust to activate only if the board recognized a loss of integrity within the company's direction, she said thoughtfully. The clause did not force us to agree with him. It forced us to examine ourselves. The room fell quiet again as the meaning of that statement settled in. Richard looked slowly around the table at the executives who had built their careers under his leadership. Some looked back at him with the same respect they always had. Others looked thoughtful, weighing the moment more carefully than before. Ava closed the notebook gently and rested her hands beside it. My grandfather believed the strength of a company was not measured by its size, she said quietly. He believed it was measured by the courage of the people responsible for protecting it. Outside the glass windows, a commuter train passed along the distant tracks, its movement barely visible from 42 floors above the city. Inside the boardroom, the quiet continued to grow, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt like the beginning of a decision. The quiet inside the boardroom deepened after Ava's words. It was no longer the uneasy silence of confusion, but the heavy stillness that comes when a room full of powerful people realizes a decision is forming, whether they are ready for it or not. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the long table, his eyes resting on the leather notebook that had once belonged to his father. The sunlight outside the glass walls had begun to soften, casting long reflections across the polished walnut surface. For years, that table had represented certainty. Every vote, every strategy, every expansion decision had ultimately followed Richard's direction. Now the center of gravity in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Margaret Klein broke the silence first. She folded her hands together carefully and looked around the boardroom at each director seated along the table. Daniel Whitmore designed the trust to activate when the board was forced to confront a question, she said. Not about ownership, about leadership. The general counsel nodded quietly beside her. The legal structure does not automatically remove Mr. Whitmore from operational control, he clarified. However, it does give the controlling shareholder the authority to determine the company's future direction. Several board members shifted in their chairs as the meaning of those words settled into place. Ava Johnson stood calmly near the far end of the table, watching the room without interrupting. She did not look like someone eager to take power. She looked like someone waiting to see what the people already in power would choose to do. Richard finally leaned forward again, resting his hands flat against the wood. My father built this company with me, he said slowly. He trusted my judgment for decades. Margaret met his gaze steadily. He also prepared for the possibility that the company might one day need a different perspective, she replied. Richard's eyes moved briefly toward Ava again. The earlier disbelief had faded, replaced by something more complicated. You have been watching this company for a long time, he said to her. Ava nodded slightly. My grandfather believed it was important to understand something before trying to lead it, she answered. One of the senior directors near the middle of the table spoke for the first time since the video recording had ended. Miss Johnson, he said cautiously, have you been involved with the company before today? Ava turned toward him. Not directly, she said, but I studied the reports he sent me. Every year. A few board members exchanged surprised looks. Richard raised an eyebrow slightly. Reports, he repeated. Ava reached into her bag again and placed a thin folder beside the notebook. Inside were several printed documents marked with dates stretching back almost a decade. Margaret opened the folder and scanned the first page. These are internal strategy summaries, she said quietly. Daniel Whitmore's private notes. Ava nodded. He wanted me to understand how the company thought, she explained. He said a leader should listen for a long time before speaking. The room remained quiet as Margaret turned another page. Richard studied the folder thoughtfully. And now you believe it is time to speak, he said. Ava looked around the boardroom again, meeting the eyes of several executives who were now watching her with open curiosity instead of skepticism. No, she replied calmly. Now it is time for the board to decide whether the company still remembers what it was built for. Margaret closed the folder slowly and rested her hands on it. The responsibility in the room had shifted once more, this time settling squarely on the people seated around the table. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the skyline outside the window before turning his attention back toward the board. For the first time in years, he was not the only voice shaping the direction of Whitmore Capital. And everyone in the room could feel that the next word spoken would determine far more than who controlled 51% of the company. The boardroom remained suspended in a thoughtful stillness after Ava Johnson's last words. The skyline of Chicago stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, but inside the room, every eye had slowly returned to the long walnut table where the future of Whitmore Capital was now being quietly weighed. Margaret Klein rested her hands on the folder Ava had placed before them, her fingers lightly touching the edge as if the papers carried more than numbers and strategy notes. They carried history. She looked around the room once more, meeting the eyes of each board member before speaking. Daniel Whitmore did not design this trust to create chaos, she said calmly. He designed it to force clarity. The statement settled over the room like a careful reminder. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his posture composed but no longer commanding in the way it had been earlier that afternoon. For years he had guided the company through aggressive expansions, global acquisitions, and some of the most profitable decades in Whitmore Capital's history. No one in the room could deny that. Yet now the quiet question hanging in the air had nothing to do with profits. It had to do with direction. One of the directors near the far side of the table leaned forward slightly. His name was Harold Bennett, a senior board member who had joined the company nearly 20 years earlier when Whitmore Capital first expanded into international markets. The trust clause forces a conversation we have avoided for some time, he said carefully. Not about Richard's leadership in the past. About the company's values moving forward. Several heads nodded slowly. Ava stood quietly near the end of the table, watching the discussion without interrupting. She did not appear impatient or triumphant. She looked like someone listening closely, the way her grandfather had taught her. Richard glanced briefly toward Harold before returning his attention to Margaret. If the board wishes to evaluate the company's direction, that discussion can happen without handing control to someone who has never run a corporation, he said. His voice was calm, but the tension beneath it was impossible to ignore. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the windows where the afternoon sunlight had begun to soften into the warmer tones of early evening. My grandfather did not ask the board to trust my experience, she said quietly after a moment. He asked the board to trust the principle he built this company on. Margaret studied Ava carefully. And what principle do you believe that was? She asked. Ava reached gently toward the notebook again and opened to another page. The paper carried the same familiar handwriting, steady and deliberate. She read the lines slowly, her voice clear but calm. Success means nothing if the people responsible for it forget the people who made it possible. The room absorbed the sentence in silence. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, remembering the man who had once written those words during the earliest days of the company. Richard's expression remained composed, but he could not hide the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Harold Bennett leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. Daniel Whitmore believed business should strengthen communities, not simply extract value from them, he said. Ava nodded. He told me that companies grow strongest when they remember the responsibility that comes with success. Margaret looked slowly around the table again, measuring the quiet reactions of the board members seated beside her. Some looked reflective, others looked uncertain, but none looked dismissive anymore. The conversation had crossed an invisible line. Richard Whitmore finally exhaled and rested his hands together. You are asking the board to believe that a principle written decades ago should outweigh the leadership that built this company into what it is today, he said. Ava met his gaze steadily. No, she replied. I am asking the board to decide whether the company your father built still belongs to that principle. The room fell silent once again. Outside, the sun dipped lower over the city skyline. Inside the boardroom, the question Daniel Whitmore had left behind waited patiently for its answer. The boardroom held its breath after Ava Johnson's question settled into the air. The city beyond the windows had begun to glow in the amber light of early evening. But inside Whitmore Capital's 42nd floor conference room, time seemed to slow. Margaret Klein remained still at the center of the table, her eyes thoughtful as she looked from Ava to Richard Whitmore and then to the rest of the board. Daniel Whitmore's words lingered in the room even though the recording had ended long ago. For years the company had operated under Richard's direction with confidence and momentum, but now the deeper question Daniel had left behind had surfaced at last. Harold Bennett shifted slightly in his chair and cleared his throat. The founder understood something many companies forget, he said carefully. Success creates power, and power tests character. A few board members nodded quietly. Richard Whitmore rested his hands together on the table, the polished wood reflecting the faint lines of the skyline behind him. He looked composed, but the authority that once filled the room so easily around him had softened into something more reflective. No one in this room has ever forgotten the responsibility of leadership, he said. His voice remained steady, though the certainty that once accompanied every word had changed. Ava did not challenge him immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the center of the table, stopping beside the chair where Daniel Whitmore himself had once sat years earlier during the company's earliest board meetings. Her movement was quiet, but every person in the room followed it with their eyes. "My grandfather never believed leadership failed all at once," she said calmly. "He believed it drifted. Slowly. One compromise at a time." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You believe that drift has already begun," she said. Ava nodded once. "He believed it might," she answered. The room remained quiet again as the thoughts settled across the board members seated around the long table. Harold Bennett looked toward Richard. "The trust clause exists because Daniel Whitmore wanted accountability," he said. "Not punishment." Richard's gaze remained steady. "And you believe this meeting represents that accountability," he replied. Harold did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the folder containing Daniel's notes, and then back toward Ava. "I believe Daniel Whitmore wanted the board to remember why this company existed in the first place," he said finally. Margaret's fingers rested lightly on the notebook Ava had opened earlier. The worn leather cover looked small compared to the polished scale of the modern boardroom, yet its presence carried more influence than any quarterly report. "Daniel once told me something during the early expansion years," Margaret said thoughtfully. "He said the moment a company begins protecting its power more than its purpose is the moment it begins losing both." Richard listened without interruption. Ava remained standing quietly beside the table, her posture calm but resolute. The sunlight outside had now begun to fade into the cooler blue of evening. "This company has grown into one of the largest investment firms in the country," Richard said after a moment. "Thousands of employees depend on the stability of our leadership." Ava met his gaze steadily. "And they also depend on its integrity," she replied. The words were simple, but the way they settled into the room carried weight. Margaret slowly closed the notebook and placed it beside the legal documents confirming the ownership transfer. She looked around the table once more, measuring the expressions of each board member carefully. Some looked uncertain, others thoughtful, but no one dismissed the conversation anymore. The boardroom that once echoed with Richard Whitmore's laughter at the beginning of the meeting had transformed into something far quieter and far more serious. Margaret finally spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "Daniel Whitmore did not design this trust to control the company from beyond his lifetime," she said. "He designed it to give the board the courage to ask the question he believed every company must eventually face." She looked directly at Richard and then at Ava. "The question is no longer whether Ava Johnson owns 51% of Whitmore Capital," she said. "The question is what this company will choose to become next." And as the evening light settled across the glass walls of the boardroom, every person seated at the table understood that the answer to that question was now in their hands. The last of the evening sunlight faded from the glass walls of the Whitmore Capital boardroom, leaving the city skyline glowing in soft blue and gold reflections. Inside the room, the quiet had become almost deliberate, as if every person present understood that the next word spoken would shape the future of the company more than any acquisition or market report ever had. Margaret Klein remained seated at the center of the table, her posture composed, her eyes thoughtful as she looked across the board members gathered around the polished walnut surface. The question she had spoken moments earlier still lingered in the air. What this company would choose to become next. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table with his hands resting lightly together. For years that chair had symbolized unquestioned authority, yet now it felt less like a throne and more like a responsibility waiting to be examined. His gaze moved briefly toward the leather notebook that had once belonged to his father before returning to Ava Johnson, standing calmly across the table. "My father believed companies needed guardians," Richard said quietly. "Not rulers." Ava listened without interrupting. Margaret watched the exchange closely. Richard continued, his voice measured but reflective. "When Whitmore Capital began, there were only 6 employees in a borrowed office above a hardware store. My father told me then that leadership meant protecting something larger than yourself." He paused, glancing toward the window where the lights of downtown Chicago were beginning to shimmer across the evening streets. "Somewhere along the way," he added slowly, "that lesson became harder to see." The room remained still. Ava stepped slightly closer to the table, her expression calm. "My grandfather believed success could make that lesson easier to forget," she said. Richard nodded once. "Yes," he replied quietly. Harold Bennett leaned forward again in his chair, his hands folded thoughtfully. The trust clause was not meant to replace leadership, he said. It was meant to remind it. Several board members exchanged quiet glances. The tension that had once filled the room earlier that afternoon had transformed into something else entirely. Reflection. Margaret rested her hand gently on the notebook again before speaking. Daniel Whitmore believed this board would eventually face a moment when the company needed to choose between comfort and principle, she said. I believe this is that moment. Richard studied the table for a long moment before looking up again. Then the board should decide openly, he said. Margaret nodded slowly. The legal documents confirm that Ava Johnson now holds the controlling shares, she said. However, the structure of Whitmore Capital still requires a vote from the board regarding executive leadership. Ava remained quiet, her attention focused on the directors seated around the table. Richard glanced toward her once more. You walked into this room knowing you could take control immediately, he said. Ava shook her head slightly. I walked into this room hoping the board would prove my grandfather right, she answered. Margaret studied Ava carefully. Right about what? Ava's voice remained steady. That the people responsible for this company would remember why it was built. The silence that followed felt different now. It carried a quiet sense of direction. Margaret looked slowly around the table at each board member before finally speaking again. Then we should begin, she said. One by one the directors shifted forward in their chairs, the long polished table reflecting their movements like a still lake. Richard Whitmore remained at the head of the table, watching the board that had once followed him without question now preparing to weigh the future with greater care. Ava Johnson stood quietly beside the notebook that carried her grandfather's words, the same words that had quietly guided the moment unfolding in front of them. And in the soft evening light of the Whitmore Capital boardroom, the decision Daniel Whitmore had prepared for many years earlier was finally ready to be made. Margaret Klein's words settled into the room with quiet finality. Then we should begin. The directors around the table straightened almost at the same moment, the subtle movement carrying the weight of something far greater than a routine corporate vote. For years their decisions had followed familiar patterns, guided by reports, projections, and the confident direction of Richard Whitmore. Tonight the process felt different. Tonight they were not voting on expansion or strategy. They were voting on the soul of the company Daniel Whitmore had built decades earlier. The city lights outside the glass walls had fully awakened now, the streets of Chicago glowing beneath the evening sky as traffic moved like slow rivers of white and red across the grid below. Inside the boardroom, the only sound was the quiet shifting of papers and the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. Margaret rested her hands together on the table and looked toward the general counsel. Please confirm the process, she said calmly. The lawyer nodded once and adjusted the screen of his laptop so the directors could see the voting record form displayed there. Under the corporate structure of Whitmore Capital, he said clearly, the board may confirm or replace executive leadership through a majority vote. The controlling shareholder may participate in the decision, but does not automatically appoint the chief executive officer. Ava Johnson listened without reacting. She stood quietly beside the leather notebook that had belonged to her grandfather, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his posture straight but no longer rigid. The earlier tension in his expression had softened into something closer to reflection. Margaret glanced briefly at him before addressing the room. This board has always respected Richard Whitmore's leadership, she said. The question before us is whether that leadership still represents the direction Daniel Whitmore intended for this company. Harold Bennett was the first to speak. Richard built Whitmore Capital into one of the most respected investment firms in the country, he said thoughtfully. But Daniel created the principles that made that growth possible. Another director nodded. The trust clause exists because Daniel Whitmore believed leadership must be accountable even to the future, she added. Richard listened quietly as the discussion unfolded around him. Ava watched the board with calm patience, her expression steady but attentive. Margaret finally looked toward Richard directly. Would you like to speak before the vote begins? She asked. Richard took a slow breath and leaned slightly forward in his chair. The reflections of the city lights shimmered faintly across the polished table between him and the board members who had followed him for so many years. My father taught me that leadership is not about holding power, he said quietly. It is about protecting what power is meant to serve. The room remained silent as he continued. If this board believes Whitmore Capital has drifted from that purpose, then you have the responsibility to correct it. His eyes moved briefly toward Ava. And perhaps my father knew that one day someone would remind us of the principles we began with. Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. Thank you, she said. She turned toward the rest of the directors. We will now proceed with the vote regarding executive leadership of Whitmore Capital. One by one, the board members entered their decisions into the system displayed on the screen. The quiet tapping of keys echoed softly through the room, each sound carrying more significance than any boardroom conversation that had taken place earlier that afternoon. Ava remained still beside the table, watching without interruption. Richard sat at the head of the table, his hands folded calmly as the final votes were entered. After a few seconds, the system displayed the result on the screen. Margaret looked down at the numbers before lifting her eyes to the room. The decision Daniel Whitmore had prepared for years earlier had finally been made. Margaret Klein looked at the result displayed on the screen for several long seconds before speaking. The glow of the numbers reflected faintly in her glasses, but her expression remained calm and measured. Around the table, the directors sat quietly, each of them understanding that the decision in front of them would echo far beyond the walls of the boardroom. The final count was clear. The majority had spoken. Margaret lifted her gaze slowly and looked first toward Richard Whitmore, then toward Ava Johnson standing beside the leather notebook that had started the entire conversation. The board has completed the vote, she said evenly. The room held its breath again, though this time the tension felt different. It felt resolved. By majority decision, Margaret continued. The board confirms Ava Daniel Johnson as the new Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Capital. No one reacted immediately. The announcement did not arrive with applause or celebration. It arrived with the quiet gravity of history turning a page. Ava did not move at first. She stood exactly where she had been standing throughout the meeting, absorbing the moment without triumph. Across the table, Richard Whitmore remained seated in the chair that had symbolized the company's leadership for nearly 2 decades. His face revealed little emotion, but his eyes rested briefly on the leather notebook before lifting toward Ava again. Harold Bennett broke the silence first. Daniel Whitmore prepared for this moment long before any of us realized it was coming, he said thoughtfully. Several board members nodded quietly. Margaret folded her hands together and turned her attention back toward Richard. Richard, she said gently, your leadership shaped this company for many years. That will always remain part of Whitmore Capital's history. Richard listened without interruption. After a moment, he slowly stood from the head chair and rested his hand on the back of it. The movement was small, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. For the first time since the meeting had begun, that chair was no longer his. Richard looked across the table toward Ava with a thoughtful expression that carried none of the disbelief from earlier that afternoon. My father believed leadership belonged to the person willing to protect the company's purpose, he said quietly. Ava met his gaze calmly. He believed leadership meant listening first, she replied. Richard nodded once. Then perhaps he chose wisely. The room remained silent as the moment passed between them. Margaret rose from her seat next. There is one final formality, she said, her voice steady but respectful. She gestured toward the chair at the head of the table. The position of Chief Executive Officer carries a responsibility that now belongs to Ava Johnson. Ava looked toward the chair for a moment without moving. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, the city stretched beneath them, the lights of Chicago reflecting across the river and the distant skyline. For a brief second, the room felt very small compared to the weight of what had just changed. Ava finally stepped forward. Her movement was calm, unhurried, almost quiet enough to disappear beneath the hum of the building's evening ventilation. When she reached the head of the table, she placed the leather notebook gently beside the seat before resting her hand lightly on the back of the chair Richard had just left. The notebook remained there like a silent reminder of the man who had built the company from nothing more than an idea and a set of principles written in careful ink decades earlier. Ava looked around the table at the directors who were now watching her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. My grandfather believed companies should leave the world better than they found it, she said softly. The words were simple, but the room listened as if hearing them for the first time. Margaret nodded slowly. Harold Bennett leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. Richard Whitmore remained standing beside the window, watching the moment unfold. And as Ava Johnson finally took her seat at the head of the table, the legacy Daniel Whitmore had prepared for many years earlier quietly became the future of Whitmore Capital. For a few seconds after Ava Johnson sat down in the chair at the head of the table, no one spoke. The moment did not feel dramatic or loud. It felt quiet, almost reflective, like the end of a long story that had taken decades to unfold. The leather notebook rested beside Ava's hand on the polished walnut surface, its worn edges standing in quiet contrast to the sleek glass walls and modern technology that surrounded the boardroom. Outside the windows, the lights of Chicago shimmered across the river, and the city continued its evening rhythm far below the 42nd floor without any awareness that something significant had just changed above it. Inside the room, the directors watched the young woman now seated where Richard Whitmore had led the company for so many years. Ava did not immediately speak. Instead, she looked around the table slowly, meeting the eyes of each board member with the same calm presence she had carried since the moment she walked into the room. Margaret Klein observed her carefully. Over the years, she had watched many executives take that chair with confidence or ambition. Ava's expression was different. It carried a sense of responsibility rather than victory. Richard Whitmore remained standing near the window, his silhouette framed against the glowing skyline. For a long moment, he simply watched the boardroom in silence, as if seeing it from a new perspective. The chair that had once belonged to him now held someone chosen by the man who had built the company from the ground up. Richard finally spoke, his voice steady and quiet. "My father used to say that leadership is not proven when everything is going well," he said. "It is proven when the future becomes uncertain." Ava listened carefully before responding. "He told me something similar," she said. "He said uncertainty is the moment when principles matter the most." Richard nodded once, accepting the words without argument. Margaret leaned forward slightly in her chair. "Whitmore Capital has entered a new chapter," she said thoughtfully. "The responsibility now belongs to all of us to make sure the company continues to honor the foundation Daniel Whitmore built." Harold Bennett folded his hands together as he looked toward Ava. "Your grandfather trusted you with this company because he believed you would remember that foundation," he said. Ava glanced briefly at the notebook before answering. "He trusted the people in this room as well," she replied calmly. "He believed leadership should never belong to one voice alone." The room remained quiet again, but the silence now carried a different tone. Earlier that afternoon it had been filled with tension and disbelief. Now it felt steady, like the first breath after a difficult decision had finally been made. Ava placed her hand lightly on the leather notebook and opened it once more to the final page Daniel Whitmore had written. The handwriting there was simple and deliberate, just one short sentence that seemed almost too small to carry the weight it held. Ava read it softly. "A company will always reflect the character of the people brave enough to lead it." The directors around the table listened without interruption. The sentence settled gently into the room like a final echo from the man who had started it all decades earlier in a small office above a hardware store. Ava closed the notebook and looked up again. The city lights reflected faintly across the polished table as she spoke one last time. "Whitmore Capital was built on the belief that success should serve something greater than profit," she said. "If we remember that, the future of this company will always be stronger than its past." Margaret nodded slowly. Harold Bennett offered a quiet smile of approval. Even Richard Whitmore allowed a faint expression of recognition to cross his face. And as the boardroom of Whitmore Capital settled into a calm silence beneath the evening skyline, the legacy of Daniel Whitmore remained exactly where he had always intended it to be. Not in the power of one person, but in the principles shared by everyone responsible for carrying the company forward.